measure. So, three different types of measurement we'll talk about today. One is the halfway point. So, for instance, I'll subdivide the top half from the bottom half, and it feels pretty good now, but I know that as I develop it, my perception will be drastically altered depending on whatever else is going on here. So let's get the nose shape squared away, and let's make sure that that lines up here. Yeah, lines up there. We have this sort of jowl area. We got this little shadow here, which is helpful. So you see I'm sort of carving out from the center here, but keeping in mind those thirds. And how those thirds, like this is the ear, let's say, and I've created the block or the surrounding, right? Now what I'm doing is I'm creating these thirds, like very, very important key players on this side, and making sure that they line up with the real central point. So I'm creating a bit of I know this is a very abstract diagram, but this is a representation of where my attention onto the structure of the proportions really is. And you'll develop every drawing slightly differently depending on how you feel about it. So your intuition should sort of guide you as you develop these skills. Okay, we'll come back here. Okay, we see that. Chin. There's a beautiful little shape right here underneath the chin, just so helpful. It separates the jawline from the other forms down here, whatever the person has, and it makes things much, much easier to kind of lock onto it much quicker. Then you'll notice there's this huge dark shape back here, and that cups the back of the skull very, very nicely. Very, very, very nicely. Yeah, this makes it much, much easier. And you'll notice it's almost like this big back shape. It's like another kind of chunk that I'm using to help the drawing move along. So now when I shade in, it's very important to keep the shading calm. Because if I make shading way too active, so if it's like has a lot of visual static, it'll detract from the drawing because my attention will be pulled towards it. Whereas if I make it smoother, more even, more professional looking, it makes the drawing actually move along far smoother because it doesn't take up as much attention units in my mind as I work. And at a certain point, part of the moving forward is organizing what I already have. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll come in with an eraser, and I'll pretend like it's a white pencil. And I'll start removing some of this visual static so that I can continue with my life from a clean base. And lots of times I'll treat just the edge, just like the charcoal, just like painting, where you're really only painting with one edge at a time. And it's a very relaxing experience to be able to push around the positive and negative light and dark spaces like this, knowing that every brushstroke I put down is moving me closer and closer towards the finished result. The opposite of that would be imagining like I have the back of a number 2 pencil eraser and I'm erasing my essay because I failed, right? Bad mentality. But instead what I do is I imagine that every eraser stroke is actually moving me towards a beautiful finished drawing. This point that I'll find on my model, this is my model today, I want to resonate with on my specific drawing from the top to the middle to the bottom. So halfway point is absolutely critical. Now another one, which is a little bit more approximate and not so exact, is measuring a height to a width. Now that's measuring let's say this totally across versus totally top to bottom, right? And then I compare the two by simply flipping my pen, pencil, paintbrush, whatever, this way and measuring the difference. It's much more approximate, though I can get a very good result and I can corral in my drawing in the early stages so that it doesn't get out of control too fast, too soon. So it's a helpful thing to do. And then the third one, which can go two ways. You can measure thirds, which I don't particularly recommend. It's a little bit too much information to handle all at once. Or you could do quarters. So for instance, we talked about a half, right? This is the half. You could subdivide that half into a half. And that way you can more easily see one piece at a time, this piece, and subdivide that and then make sure all these points are lining up within that quadrant. So those are the three different measuring styles that I wanted to talk about, and a few things I feel like you should know before we get into it. And one is, if you're working on a figure, like let's say like a figure study, like a person, you know, they're standing and they have their leg out, you know, their arm and their hip or something. What you should never ever do is measure a head and compare it to the rest of the body. This is the biggest mistake I see every artist make. And the reason why it's such a terrible mistake is because if I measure something as small as a head and I compare it all the way down the body, the measuring becomes very inaccurate by the nature of it, because I'm creating multiple comparisons over and over and over again, and I don't know if they're exact. So very, very bad style, unless you're drawing from imagination. If you're drawing from imagination, you can rely on that, because drawing from imagination, it's more structure building as opposed to perceptual or optical drawing. So the equivalent on a head would be like measuring like an eye and then trying to compare it to a bunch of other arbitrary measurements all over the face. This is a terrible habit that I see lots of people get into, and it's completely unreliable and does not work. So what I'd like to show you is the way that works every time. Now, measuring, of course, sometimes